So welcome, I'm Beth Ribet, the Director of Repair and the host of the Civics Project, and I'd like to welcome both our Zoom and our podcast audience to our episode this week on family and medical leave. Before we begin, I'd like to offer a brief land acknowledgement. Repair acknowledges the Gabrielina Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tobangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Tarahatone, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanukvatam, the ancestors, Ahihiram, the elders, and Eohinkam, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. And as noted, our subject matter today focuses on family and medical leave law and policy. So to initiate our discussion, I want to start by defining family and medical leave and what types of leave taking our legal system recognizes. So there are three major primary recognized types of family and medical leave and a few variations in addition to that. But the three main types, the first is parental leave. And under our federal and most state laws, this includes both leave taking for a birth by parents of any gender, or leave taking for adoption, and again applies to men, women, non-binary people, no gender restrictions on that. So you don't have to be a person who is pregnant to take parental leave, but it involves the forming of a relationship between a parent and a child, whether through birth or adoption. The second type of leave is disability. My cat is joining the conversation. And disability leave is pretty much what you would expect. It's leave taking because you have a serious health condition that is temporarily keeping you from work. And it may be that it means you're completely unable to work. It may mean that you could work, but not without endangering your health. It may mean that you can work part-time on a reduced schedule, and it is possible to take sort of partial or reduced leaves in that way. And the third type of leave taking is what's known as caregiver leave. And this is leave to care for a loved one who has a serious health condition. And the type of family caregiving that law will recognize in the United States tends to be limited. But I wanted to also just mention some of the other types of leave taking. Some states recognize leave taking if you are a victim of domestic violence or stalking and need some time either to deal with the legal processes to make sure that you're safe from someone who might be, for instance, threatening or disrupting your ability to get to work or focus on work, or just to recover as you are dealing with that incident. So again, the federal law does not necessarily recognize this in the same way, but individual states can opt to create leave-taking rights for survivors of domestic violence or stalking. And in addition, our federal law and sometimes states also have additional leave-taking protections, which are still about caregiving, but are about caregiving for a service member, someone who's been in the military and is coming home with disability or injuries and needs some extended time to recover. So I want to talk about what the federal laws are that protect leave taking. And the primary one is the Family and Medical Leave Act, which was initiated through Congress and signed into law in 1993 and went into effect subsequently. And the FMLA, the Family and Medical Leave Act of the United States, recognizes the three primary types of leave I talked about and also recognizes caring for a service member as a fourth type of protected leave. So under the FMLA, we want to understand a little bit more about what it covers. So first of all, family and medical leave rights, the right to take leave from work, is not available to every worker. To be recognized under the federal law, you need to first have worked for 12 months at an employer. And in those 12 months, you need to have worked at least 1,250 hours, which would work out to be somewhere in the range of about 25 hours on average per week. So for instance, if you're working for two different employers part-time and you worked for one for 15 hours and one for 18 hours, you wouldn't, under the federal law, be covered by either if they were totally separate employers. because you would not have worked enough hours for either one to be covered. In addition, even if you have worked for an employer for 12 months at least and have worked 1,250 hours in the past 12 months, you still are only covered if you are working for an employer that's recognized as falling under this law. And practically what that means is that it needs to be an employer that has at least 50 employees. So if you have fewer than 50 employees and you are seeking protection, or if you work for an employer that's a small business that has fewer than 50 employees and you're seeking protection under federal law, you would not be able to get it under the Family and Medical Leave Act. In addition, the Family and Medical Leave Act does not apply to the federal government itself. So you couldn't say, I want family and medical leave protection under the FMLA, under the Family and Medical Leave Act, if you worked for the US government. So it excludes government, excludes federal government employees. State employees are somewhat covered. It excludes small and mid-sized businesses with fewer than 50 employees. And it also excludes people who have been working for less than 12 months for this employer, or people who have worked for more than 12 months, but have not worked at least 1,250 hours in the last year. So only if you don't fall under any of those exclusions would you be covered by the Family and Medical Leave Act. And again, the covered bases under the FMLA are birth or adoption, caregiving, and family caregiving applies to parents, children. So your son or daughter, your parent, or your spouse. So you cannot be protected by the federal law if you wanted to care for a sibling, an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent. None of those would be protected under the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act. A serious health condition as defined under the Family and Medical Leave Act is something which either makes you unable to work at all or unable to perform some of the functions of your work. And again, it's possible to get Family and Medical Leave Act protection if you need a reduced schedule, like working 10 hours rather than 40 hours a week while you are recovering from surgery. So in total, you can have up to 12 weeks of protected leave under the federal law per year. Now, there's some, again, rules and exceptions, like for instance, your employer can require that you first exhaust all your paid vacation or personal leave before you start taking family and medical leave, so they can make you use up your vacation time before you're allowed to start using this protection. And if they provide you with any kind of paid leave as a worker's benefit, you might have to use that first, run that out before you start your leave taking under the FMLA. And then I noted that the Family and Medical Leave Act also protects additional family leave for service members. You can get up to 26 weeks per year, so half the year, 6 months, to care for a family member who's developed a serious health condition in the context of military service. And the 12-week limit will not apply. So you can have 26 weeks in total. If you took 12 weeks under the other provisions, you could have another 14 weeks to add up to 26 in total for a service member. And this is a relatively newer addition to the Family and Medical Leave Act. So when we say you have a right to take leave, the next question people tend to ask is, well, what does that mean? Does that mean my boss will pay for me to take time off? Do I lose my salary? Yes, you do. So paid time off is not a protection under the Family and Medical Leave Act. But what it does do is say, if you take a family or medical leave protected by the FMLA, you can have up to 12 weeks in a 1-year period off work. And you can come back to your same position or to the closest equivalent position that your employer can offer you if they were not able to hold the same one open. So the basic idea is that you don't lose your job. You can take these 12 weeks off, 26 if it's partly leave taking to care for a service member, and you can still come back to work. In addition, while you are on leave, if you have employer provided benefits such as health insurance or disability benefits or anything else, you don't lose them during your leave. Now, if you're normally paying for them, paying premiums for those benefits through paycheck withholding, you might need to make arrangements to pay those premiums while you're gone. So it doesn't mean that employer will pay to take over anything that would normally be on you. But whatever else you're entitled to, you have a right to keep even though you are not working, including the portions the employer would normally pay for. So you don't lose your benefits in those 12 weeks. You're allowed to come back to work. And the protection the law gives you is the right to take a leave without retaliation. And retaliation could include being demoted. It could include having your pay reduced after you return, or any other adverse employment action, like not having the opportunity to apply for a promotion, or not being retained as long, or not getting some benefit. The employer can, however, require medical documentation from a healthcare provider showing that you are able medically to return to work. So let's say you take your 12 weeks and your employer is saying, I don't know if you're able to do the job now safely. I need medical documentation. That they can do, and the law will not see that as retaliation. But they can't take your job away. They can't demote you. They can't basically cause some adverse impact on you, whether by reducing a benefit, by changing in some harmful way your work responsibilities, or by denying you an opportunity that you otherwise would have had if you had not taken this leave. As noted, what rights are not available, except when you're caring for a service member, the FMLA does not protect you after 12 weeks in a one-year period. It doesn't provide any rights to have your leave be paid, so you do lose your salary when you're on leave. So some things are not protected, but at least these basic protections are. Now, what happens? You've got these rights on paper. What happens if an employer refuses to comply? So the Family and Medical Leave Act at the federal level also gives you a right to sue. It creates causes of action, including retaliation. So if an employer is refusing to grant your leave or is trying to retaliate against you, you can complain to the federal government. You can go to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in some cases. You can sue. So you've got rights that courts will recognize, that the federal government will recognize if an employer is not complying with the FMLA. So what do you do if you get sick or injured, or you have a family member who's sick or injured, or for whatever reason, you need more than 12 weeks? So possibly you leave that job, you might lose it. But there are a few other possibilities that exist for some workers. So this doesn't apply to family or caregiving leave, but for people who need a disability leave. So you are sick or injured yourself. The courts have found that you can ask for up to 1 year of leave and still come back to work as a protection under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So this won't help you with parenting. It won't help you with caregiving. But if you need more than 12 weeks for your own recovery, another federal law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, can potentially protect you in giving you more time to take off work and then come back. After that, mostly what we look to is the states. So 9 states in the United States and the District of Columbia currently have laws that provide for paid family leave. These states include California, Colorado, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, and Washington. And as noted also, I mentioned the District of Columbia. And some of these laws provide, these are laws which provide that the state will give you some replacement wages, usually less than your salary, but hopefully enough to keep you afloat if you need it, when you take a medical leave. So you can still have the federal protection to be able to come back to work and not lose your benefits. And the states, if you live in those 9 states in DC, and if the laws in question apply to you as an employee, will give you some replacement wages to cover what you're losing by taking time off work. And you can think of this system as something, it's not the same as unemployment benefits, but it operates somewhat similarly. They'll calculate a portion of your wages up to a capped amount, which you can receive from the state as disability or paid family leave benefits temporarily when you need time off work. In addition, some of the states and DC will provide wider protections to groups of employees. So for instance, some states, I mentioned for the Family and Medical Leave Act, you're not covered unless you're one of at least 50 employees working for that employer. And there's some more minutiae and restrictions that also affect that. States can lower that number so they can cover, if they choose to, smaller or mid-sized businesses. So some states, for instance, will cover employers that have at least 15 employees. Some will say 20, 30, 40, something like that. In addition to the 9 states in DC that provide for paid family leave, more of the US states, most US states actually have some kind of program that only covers disability leave. So not just in those 9 states in DC, in most parts of the United States, there is some protection for employees who become temporarily disabled or injured in a way that keeps them away for a while from work. And if you are able to access that in your state, then you can also get those replacement disability wages from your state government. But again, other than the 9 states I mentioned in the District of Columbia, this would not apply to parental leave, maternity, or paternity leave. It would not apply to caregiver leave, so staying home to care for a family member. Other things that states can do that are helpful is they can expand recognition of who you get to give care to. So I mentioned the federal standard is spouse, parent, son, or daughter, and that's basically it. But states can recognize siblings. They may recognize older family members like grandparents, right? So they may, if they choose to, allow for a broader range of caregiving possibilities. The states also get to decide how long, if they're giving you any sort of paid benefit, it's going to be. So it doesn't have to be the 12 weeks that you'd get from the federal government for leave, right? So you might only have paid state leave for a portion of that. For instance, in my home state of California, you can, if I take a leave, I'm protected by the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act from losing my job or losing my benefits, or from retaliation. In addition, if it's a disability leave, if I need to recover from an injury or illness, the state will give me up to 12 weeks of partial salary replacement. However, if it's a family leave, if I were to have a baby or adopt a baby, or I had a partner who was having a baby, or if I needed to take care of a sick family member, the state would give me up to 6 weeks of caregiver pay. So not the full 12, but California will give us 6. And each of the states that chooses to provide for any paid family leave can decide how long and how much they're going to give. And it varies, and it can vary by type, like it can be different amounts as noted in California for disability as opposed to parental or caregiver leave. Now, one of the common questions folks ask about family and medical leave is, how does it relate to sick leave? What's the difference between medical leave and sick leave? And it's a legal definition, right? Often we would think of, if you're taking a medical leave, it's because you're sick, right? So we would think of it as the same thing. But under the law, right, laws define sick leave as something they may require an employer to provide as a paid benefit. So 15 states and the District of Columbia, I'm not going to list all 15, but 15 states in DC currently have requirements that employers must pay for employees to have a certain amount of access to sick leave during the year. Now, one major difference between sick leave and medical leave is that it's a lot less time, right? So the employers may have to pay for it, but generally it would be something like for every 30 hours, depends by state, but for every 30 hours you work, you get 1 hour of sick leave, or for every 40 hours you work, you get 1 hour sick leave. So over a year, you might basically rack up something like 48 hours of paid sick leave time. And the sick leave laws can also restrict how much of that you're allowed to use in a 1-year period. So for instance, sometimes they can say, yes, you can save up to 48 hours of paid sick leave, which in an 8-hour day would mean 6 days, but you're only allowed to use 3 of them in a year, but you can roll them over to the next year. So we're not talking about 12 weeks or 6 weeks. We're talking about a few days in which states may require employers to pay for you to be sick. And it doesn't have to be, and again, this can be a very ordinary illness. You wouldn't usually take a family and medical leave unless you had, because you had a cold, right? You would just take a little sick time. Unless it was something unusual, like you already had a very compromised immune system and you caught a cold, and that means it's dangerous and you need to, stay home or be hospitalized and recover. But for ordinary illnesses, sick leave laws are there to make sure that you have a few days where you don't lose your pay and your employer recognizes that you have a right to time off. And in many states, sick time can be used also for preventative care, so you don't actually have to be sick. You could use it to go and get routine doctor's visits accomplished. Or you could use it for family caregiving. So if you have a sick child and you have some sick days available through your employer, then sick days can be used for that. And again, this is completely separate from the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act, and it's also separate from state medical leave laws. So sick leave laws are distinct, and they're there to actually make the employer pay for you to have a little bit, a few days, usually a year, of paid time off. And both state medical leave laws and state sick leave laws may recognize domestic violence or stalking as a basis to take leave. So they don't have to, but some states have opted to do that. So the next area I wanted to just briefly review is, does everybody in practice have the same rights? What happens with these laws? Does it mean everybody gets to take leave when they want to? Does it mean everybody is able to use them? And the answer, as you might imagine, is that no, for one obvious reason. Not everybody has the same access to take leave, because not everybody can afford time off. So if you live in a state that doesn't have paid leave, or you live in one of those states, but you're not one of the types of employees who's covered, whether because you're a gig worker, you're self-employed, you work for a small employer, whatever the restriction is, you've been bouncing between different jobs part-time, you haven't been there that long, you may not be covered even if you have a state law that pays, and many states don't. So if you cannot afford to take time off for long, the fact that the federal law allows you to do it without losing the job doesn't mean you can do it in practice. And even, you can understand, I think, pretty intuitively why for working and poverty class people, saying you can have 12 weeks of unpaid leave isn't that much protection. Even for middle class workers, many of them, particularly those who are raising families or have plenty of expenses or live in just, an area where the cost of living is high, may still not be able to afford 12 weeks, right? That's basically up to 3 months per year, though it can be broken up between different leaves. So many people still can't afford that much time off. So in practice, the people who tend to get the full benefits of family and medical leave law tend to be those with fairly progressive or generous employers who are giving them voluntarily a lot of leave-taking rights, like, paid time off, for instance, for parenting, for anybody else, people who have external disability insurance plans, which they get on their own or through their employer that will pay for their time off, people who have plenty of money and don't need to worry about affording to take 3 months off. So we have a sort of smaller subset of American workers who are actually able to use the family and medical leave benefits in the FMLA for up to 12 weeks if they need to, without dire economic consequence. So that's one problem. A second problem is that we see that there are differences in the reasons why different groups of people need leave. So one of the things we know is that the law is written in a facially neutral way. It doesn't create different rules for men and women or for any other particular group other than obviously acknowledging people with disabilities. But there are differences in male and female relationships to pregnancy, right, and to parental leave. So we see that men tend to underutilize parental leave. They tend to take less time off even for adoptions, right? So it can't all be reduced to pregnancy, but also that women may need more medical time off to give birth in the last weeks of pregnancy, potentially, if they're resting just before and as their bodies are recovering from pregnancy. So the law gives the same amount of time for everybody, but women may need to use more of the time available. In addition, we see just major statistical patterns in how caregiving gets done in the United States. And we see that while there are plenty of wonderful men who care for family members, disproportionately, statistically, the vast majority of caregiving is done by female family members. And we can mostly just understand that as gender role and stereotypes, coupled with the fact that we still have an overall pay inequity in the United States. So we still see women making somewhere between 82 to 85 cents for each dollar on average that someone who's male makes. And of course, that, there are women who are well paid and men who are not. There's plenty of variation. So these are the statistical averages. So often when a family is thinking about who can take time off with the least damage to our income, and there are two partners and one is male and female, the mother will take time off because her job pays less. So pay inequities also factor into this, social norms, stereotypes, just the training and association between gender and nursing, right? So for a variety of reasons, women do more caregiving, women are more likely to stay home with sick children. Again, when two parents of different sexes are in the equation. So the consequence of this is that women are more likely than men to run out of leave using up caregiving and parenting time, and then not have it left for disability leave. So while the most common form of leave taking across all the categories is to take it for your personal medical needs, women are more likely than men to not have available protected time to do that because they've already used it up other ways in the last 12 months. So we see that males, and statistically the highest category is white males, are more likely to be able to use 12 full weeks of disability leave if they need it, and women are more likely to have to split that time between categories. And of course, as we've already noted, there are lots of people who are just not taking leave because they're not covered and are not recognized under, or not fully recognized under state laws either. We see the poorest utilization rate, so the least amount of federally protected time off, goes to women of color. So when we combine racial vulnerability, which tends to mean that people are more likely to be living paycheck to paycheck, with gendered patterns of caregiving and parenting, we see women of color sort of the most strapped, taking it off only when they can afford to, using it for other people, not having it available for their own medical needs. So what happens to you if you don't have enough access to legally protected leave? Well, one option is you lose your job. A second is a phenomenon that we call presenteeism. So most of you would know the term absenteeism. It refers to when you're not around a lot, right? You're being absent, whether it's from work or school. We talk about absentees. Presenteeism is when you show up when you actually shouldn't from a health perspective. So presenteeism is people going to work who can't actually work without harming themselves medically, but they need to keep a job, to keep a paycheck, right? So presenteeism, people working while they are injured or sick. If those illnesses are contagious, right, then that creates a different set of problems in the workplace. And it's been one of the reasons why states and advocates have argued for paid sick leave, that employees need to stay home when they could make other people sick. But even if you're not contagious with anything, if it's just an injury, right, working while you're really too injured to be working, or working as many hours as you are, is one of the consequences, and is linked to the deterioration of health. If you don't have enough time to recover from surgery, if you don't have enough time to care for your loved ones, this creates family stress, conflict, wears people out, people get sicker, so it can create more negative health outcomes. When you are going back to work, when you are not recovered fully from a temporary injury or illness, you may be temporarily disabled. And the consequence of that is if your employer is expecting you should be working like you were before, you might start experiencing disability discrimination because the employer does not want to adapt the workplace to where your body or psyche is at the time. And at community levels, we see that when people have inadequate access to leave in ways that are disparate, so we know that many communities of color have less access to leave. Many documented immigrants have access to leave. Generally, undocumented immigrants have no protection under such laws. So when you don't have access to these things at the collective level, it means that more people are getting sick in your families or communities, requiring more caregiving, which also is unlikely to be protected. So we see people deteriorating both medically. When we see worse health outcomes in a community, it's often associated with the fact that people can't stop work when they need to and still be economically okay. And it also means that we see decreased economic stability in those communities. So this matters at both the individual and at the population level. So as you might imagine, there are a number of parties in the United States calling for reform, saying we need to change or expand our family and medical leave law in the United States at both the state and federal level, and in some cases even municipal levels. Usually those calls from reforms come either from labor movements, so movements that are focused on the rights of workers. Some of them come from feminists, folks who are wanting to make sure that women who are having babies or caregiving are getting enough leave to protect their jobs, not create more wage inequality or work inequalities. Some are people who are advocates more for just economic rights, like living wage advocates and benefit advocates. And sometimes healthcare providers and organizations will also get involved in advocacy on this issue. For instance, organizations for nurses or doctors, because they're seeing how much their patients need it. So some of them will start taking policy stands basically as a form of, patient advocacy at that level. Now, the last question I want to try to answer today is, what are the reforms that people are calling for? So a common one is that we should have paid federal leave, that the government should step up. It could administer those benefits through the states, but it should step up and say, yes, if you are taking a legally protected leave, we should make sure that you have an economic ability to do so. So the federal government providing for leave, whereas now just 9 states do for family and caregivers, and some, or most, but not all states do for disability. In addition, another potential reform is to not combine the caps. So rather than saying you can have 12 weeks total, say you can have 12 weeks total of disability leave, but you can also have another 6 weeks on top of that for caregiving and for pregnancy, even if you've exhausted your disability leave. So just expand the totals, and this would help to sort of work through the inequity, because women are doing more caregiving, more birthing, more parenting on the whole. So to not just have one big category, but to say, actually, you've got some time for each. And if you use up leave on a pregnancy, it doesn't mean you've lost access to take disability leave as well. Now, that's tricky because we also have to think about, like, how long is it reasonable for an employer, especially a mid-sized employer, right? It's reasonable to ask that of Coca-Cola. It might be trickier for an employer that has exactly 60 employees if suddenly the employer is going to have, several employees who will be out 6 months of the year and might do that, might want to do that each year if they've got a complex set of needs, like a lot of caregiving and a lot of disability. So it's a problem for policymakers to think through what's reasonable for industry, what's reasonable for people. And it's not a problem that can be solved without paid leave, right? If we really want this to work, people need to have paid time off. And of course, many employers couldn't afford, some could, but many employers could not afford to pay for people to have 3 to 6 months time off work when they were not working. It would become prohibitively expensive for at least the medium-sized ones. So it's tricky, but it's one of the areas where advocates are saying we need to look at possible reforms. Let's think about ways that we can make sure that people have the time off that they legitimately need without losing access to employment once they don't need it. So increasing the total leave available and not just having one combined category, but having some time available in each. And the fourth area people are asking for reform is to just expand the protection, expand it to more small businesses with federal and state support so that those businesses are not hurt economically, expand to cover more types of caregiving, letting you take care of, any family member who lives with you, for instance, even if they're not a parent or spouse or child. So it might be your grandmother who's living at home. And also just generally to recognize that a lot of us have extended kin networks and that we will take care of our family members if they need it. So to have that be something that that's available for family members, that they're not just denied coverage because it's a grandparent rather than a parent, or a sibling rather than a spouse. To provide some protections for employees who've been employed less than a year, and to provide more access to leave-taking rights for gig workers, for people who are split between multiple different employers or employed as contractors. So to figure out how to work that, how to manage that at policy level. So last things for today, and I'm glad to hear any questions from the audience. Our book recommendation for this week is titled Maternity Leave, Policy and Practice. And it's by Victoria Gordon and Beth M. Rauhaus. So the title again is Maternity Leave, Policy and Practice by Victoria Gordon and Beth M. Rauhaus. And I also want to share our trivia. So folks know when we don't have a special guest, we have 3 weekly trivia questions which relate to our topic for today. And I'm going to throw those up on slides for those of you who are with us on Zoom, but don't worry, listening audience, you will still be able to hear them through the podcast. So beginning now, our first question is, what is the most common reason for leave taking? And I kind of already mentioned it in my lecture, so we'll see if folks remember. Live audience members, feel free to say in the chat. Answer choice A is birth, B is family caregiving, C is personal health condition, and D is caregiving for a service member. And the correct answer on this one, some of you already caught this, is personal health condition, disability, leave taking, medical leave taking is the most common type. The second question, what percentage of workers who are in private industry, so not working for a state or federal or municipal government, working for a private employer, what percentage of workers have access to paid family leave? A, 4%, B, 16%, C, 25%, and D, 32%. And the right answer on this one is B, 16%. So 16% of workers who work for a private company, anything but a state or federal employer or municipal employer, have access to paid family leave, paid time off work for birth, adoption, or caregiving. The answer is 16%. Third question, among state and family and medical leave laws that cover employees working for businesses with fewer than 50 employees. So remember again, the federal law only applies to employers with at least 50 people. So for state family and medical leave laws that recognize smaller employers, what is the smallest size of employer covered? A, a minimum of 4 employees. B, a minimum of 10. C, a minimum of 20, and D, a minimum of 30. And the right answer on this one is B again, a minimum of 10. And that's only, to my knowledge, in the state of Vermont. And it only applies to children and new adoption. So if your employer has at least 10 employees in Vermont, you can get time off, you can get paid family leave for childbirth or adoption. In Vermont, if it's for medical or caregiving, you can get off as long as you have 15 employees in the workplace. So the smallest protection in the country is in the state of Vermont, only for childbirth or adoption. You can be covered if you work for an employer that has at least 10 employees. So for our attendees who would like to learn more in Zoom, I'm attaching some more resources, and I'll put those in the chat as well. And if our audience members have questions they would like to share, I'm also happy to take those now in the chat. Otherwise, we'll end our recording. Okay. So first of all, I want to say thanks to everybody who's been listening in today. Thanks to all of our podcast listeners. Today is June 6th. We will be taking a hiatus, but will return in July and August. So we'll look forward to seeing you next month and have some great people coming in to join us. And you can find out what's upcoming by visiting our events registration page, which for our podcast listeners is included in the text accompanying this episode. And for our live attendees, I'm adding it to the chat. And as new events become available, you will find them there. Thank you so much for joining us today, everyone.